general chat on, we have 45 minutes to warm up before the Q&A that will start right after. We are to engage audience with a discussion on possible scenarios, futures, foresights for Eastern Europe, generally speaking, specifically Eastern Partnership. And I will ask you individually at the very beginning, and perhaps we would start with Katerina Maternova.
Please don't start. I just got off the plane very recently.
So you don't want to start?
No, I don't want to start. Sorry.
So then I would go with the alphabetical order, even if you're okay with that. To go ahead with your general statements, I'll warm up the discussions, try to set the stage, discussing partly the success of Eastern Partnership. Can we speak of that framework in such terms, and the challenges ahead? And that's where we would begin, perhaps, and then I would ask every one of you to give a few thoughts on the subject. I'll try to be as lively as Zoom allows in the discussion between you, and then at 45 minutes into this discussion, we'll introduce Q&A, and I understand we will get Q&A from, for instance, Alex will tell us how some questions pop up and how can we integrate them into discussion.
They will come via the regular chat. So what we
they will come through regular chat.
Yeah. You will just need to tell the people to prepare their questions.
And how long is going to be the whole session?
We planned it for an hour and a half tops, but I know that Tom needs to leave slightly earlier, and then we can target 75 minutes, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, for me, it's also going to be great if it's possible to be 75 minutes.
We have the last. Good. We don't admit anyone yet, so we'll let you know when we start admitting the participants in, as people are still moving in between side events and sessions.
Okay, and we begin in 3 minutes, right?
3-4 minutes. Let's have a last blast.
I'm waiting for a sign.
Yeah.
Well, Wojciech, if you are on the phone, you're doing very well. It looks for real.
Okay, well, yeah, yeah. Congratulations to Steve Jobs and whoever made the device. But yeah, thank you. No, but it's good to see you all again. The connection seems to be smooth for everyone. The cameras are all nicely set, and the rest will be in the discussion.
I'm very sorry. Our photographer will just take a few pictures. Okay.
I have an information that we're waiting now for people to join, so let's wait 2-3 minutes and then we begin.
So should I admit them to the room? People.
Not yet. I will admit. I have the moderation
Okay.
rights. Yeah.
Okay. 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 Thank you.
I have a question. Alex, do you know if we are also on this platform live, globsec.com?
Yeah.
So,
Like you either join from there
yes.
through the side events button. So everyone was informed, and we just sent also
Okay.
the separate link in case they have difficulties. So.
And this video is now already online, visible to someone, or it will be visible only to those who join?
It will only be visible to those who join.
Okay.
Деста вече съм в това. Не, сега влизам в... Извинявай, не можеш.
Okay, we're starting to admit audience, guests who are going to listen to the first part of the debate and then will take part in our Q&A, interactive Q&A through online platform. I'm waiting for a signal from the organizers when to begin, but we're now filling the Zoom room. As Alex Martin writes, we will start momentarily. Okay, We have a green light to start to begin this side event session at today's Globsec Forum. The session's title is the Eastern Partnership, Impact on the Regional Political Crisis, on the Civil Society, and Increased Resilience for Unfolding Trends. That is an event, a side event, co-funded by the European Commission. And today we have here with us Ivan Krastev, the chairman of Center for Liberal Studies from Bulgaria, and a permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences, in Vienna. Katarina Maternova, European Commission Deputy Director General for the Neighborhood Policy and Enlargement Negotiations, and also Acting Director for a support group for Ukraine. Corina Rebegea, SIPA Director for Democratic Resilience, joining us from across the Atlantic, and Thomas de Waal, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe. This session will last about 75 minutes. Half of that time we'll spend on warm-up discussion between our honorable speakers. And then we will smoothly move to the Q&A at any given moment in time. Please feel free to introduce your comments and questions via chat box. And also in the second part, there will be room and space, moderated space for asking your questions or sharing your thoughts live through a video. My name is Wojciech Przybylski. I'm editor-in-chief of Visegrad Insight, main platform on media and analysis in Central Europe. And I'm particularly happy to be joining and moderating today's session, as together with the German Marshall Fund and a dozen of think tankers from Eastern Partnership, we produced an interesting report that you can find at Globsec and also online on Eastern Partnership 2030, 4 scenarios ahead of us, kind of ideal types that is in a way also a purpose of this session. The purpose of this session is to stimulate discussion based on foresight, future-oriented speculation, but based on existing trends about what may happen, what future may bring to Eastern European countries, part of the framework of the Eastern Partnership. I think I'll stop here and ask each of you individually to tell a few words your assessment of Eastern Partnership framework. It started 10 years ago. This year, European Commission, European Union adopted a plan for the future of the Eastern Partnership. It happened so that the plans were devised and they were prepared before pandemic. But as pandemic hit, the European Commission also hurried to help the Eastern Partnership countries with additional aid. We've seen some resources put on the where the countries of Eastern Partnership needed. But the questions are, of course, is that enough? Is it well placed? Do we see also progress that has been devised at the origin of the framework with pragmatic ambition of economic integration and political association? How will it carry on in the next years to come, especially given the current circumstances? And I don't need to remind everyone about the events that have been grasping everyone's attention when we look at the Caucasus, when we look at Minsk and many cities in Belarus, many cities and towns in Belarus, but also progress that we see also in Ukraine and Armenia when it comes to civil society emancipation. Let us begin perhaps even with your thoughts on where we are when we think about the future of Eastern Partnership and the countries that are part of this framework. Partly maybe, you know, on the framework, but also on the individual countries and approach. What are your thoughts, please?
So, Wojciech, because on the panel there are people who know much better than me both the partnership frame, but also the countries. What I'll suggest you to do is, in several minutes, much more to try to focus and to reflect how the global context in which the region has been changing. and particularly also as a result of the COVID-19. Because as you see these days, basically this part of Eastern Europe is quite exciting place. You have a real war going, Armenia, Azerbaijan. You basically have Belarus, and you have Kyrgyzstan. So from this point of view, obviously, there is a general kind of changes going on, and I'm much more interested how they're going to reflect also the major kind of trends that we can see outside of the region. So my first argument is that COVID-19 is not kind of a classical disruption, but much more, and I do believe many people are going to agree with this, strengthened and speed up trends that have been there before. And from this point of view, on the level of the geopolitics, there are two trends that go at the same time, and they're going to shape both the world, but also these regions very much. One is fragmentation, and you can see very well. And the fragmentation basically means that on economic level, we're seeing much more protectionism coming there and some of the global supply chains being restructured. I was just reading a survey which basically predicts that in the next 5 years, we're going to see between 26 and 30% of the global trade routes being changing. People talk about shortening of the global supply chains. This is one level. And from this point of view, the interesting story about these countries is that it's not quite obvious if they're going to be a fragmentation, part of which fragment they're going to end up. Secondly, we are going to see, and I don't believe that the results of the American elections are going to reverse this trend, a growing also kind of a competition between the United States and China, which is going to push for major polarization and which I do believe is going to be felt particularly strong in the technology sphere. So to a certain extent, technology is going to play the role that ideology plays in the late 1940s. Tell me which is your 5G network provider, and I'm going to tell you where political loyalty stands. And certainly on the level of the European Union, you see a level of the consolidation of the European Union as the result of the crisis, but part of this consolidation is also the hardening of the European borders, external borders. So if before, and particularly 10 years ago, European Union was about hard budgets and soft borders, I mean external borders, now we're going to see much more soft budget and hard borders. And this is also something that is going to affect the region. And also you have the domestic political dynamics in certain countries, and of course, they're very different in the three cases that I mentioned. Because if you see Belarus, and here there are people who really know much more than I do, but on one level, this is the success of Mr. Lukashenko. Basically, he created a nation, and this nation is standing against him. But also you basically understand that authoritarian regimes has the problem that beauty queens has. They have a problem with aging. And from this point of view, certain type of a political cycle is obviously there. It's interesting to see how it's going to work. And I do believe this fragmentation and geopolitical polarization at the same time create a risk factor, which I found particularly important for this part of the world, where both Russia is active, but China is active. And this is that in this moment of fragmentation versus polarization, some of the middle powers, countries like Turkey, like Russia, are going to be pushed to be very much active because they're going to try to fill the vacuum coming out of the withdrawal of the United States, basically the withdrawal of certain type of red lines and norms that have been there. I was personally, and I know that Thomas is here, so he can know more, but the most interesting story about the Azeri-Armenian conflict, of course, is not what the Azeris are doing or what Armenians are doing, this is what Turkey is doing. This is the biggest change. And from this point of view, I do believe for the region, it's going to be very much more difficult. And here I'm going to end up. Eastern Partnership was created in the moment in which the European Union is trying to see how its soft power is going to work out of the areas that were perceived as a kind of a classical enlargement areas, and also keeping in mind that we have a contested neighborhood with the Russian Federation. Now we're going to see the European Union functioning in a much more unstable political environment where for public health, for economic, but also for geopolitical reasons, I do believe many of the policies that have been perceived as being effective yesterday are not going to be as effective. But as I said, out of the people on the panel, I'm the least knowledgeable about the region.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you very much for the opening remarks. And we'll take it from there and bring it in a form of a question, perhaps already to Katerina Maternova. You know, how the European Commission can prepare for what's happening. I think when we mention Belarus, to Belarusians themselves, the events that were happening and we've observed since spring, even before elections, were a surprise in its own. The civic emancipation, if you may call it, is happening all across. It's a global trend, but particularly pronounced in the Eastern Partnership countries. And there are questions about it and how the European Commission is planning ahead. How important is the civil society in the picture of the Eastern Partnership?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And now you see why I didn't want to start the panel, because when I'm on a panel with Ivan has to start, because from the region, I think that Ivan is one of the most perceptive and let alone well-spoken thinkers of his generation. And really, I think it's always valuable to see what's happening in the global trends. So I very much subscribe and agree to the fragmentation versus polarization, even called decoupling, when we talk about the technology or the trade flows, etc., between the US and China, and the vacuum that gets created. And I think the way you called middle powers and their ascendance and their activity is something that is very much visible now. So I just thank you for that framing. You asked how we prepare for it. Well, we don't prepare. Bureaucracies don't prepare. What we can do, and what we have tried to do, is to actively react and see how the changes and the trends that are happening are influencing us. So one of the things that a little bit taken apart from the discussion on Eastern Partnership, I think, was what we have done in reaction to COVID. You remember that you may remember that at the beginning in March, there was sort of a little bit of a delayed reaction by the EU in a sense, because it was all on national competencies, whether it was about borders or reactions to the medical needs, and it took the EU to a little bit of time, a few weeks, in terms of being able to react. So there was a little bit of a March was a low point for the EU, I would say, and it was very much seen in our immediate neighborhood, where both China and Russia came in very strongly in the Balkans, in the East, sort of with the message, look, why do you want to be friends with the EU? Look at what a mess they are, and the crisis comes and they drop you like a hot potato. And so what we have done was to really put our thoughts together and worked literally day and night at that point to really refocus and realign the assistance that we have, the tools that we have at our disposal, and put packages for the countries together, both in terms of immediate assistance, PPE, medical equipment, ventilators, etc., but also money for early economic recovery, liquidity lines, etc., for SMEs. And we did something which we don't do very well and on other occasions, and I think this was a big lesson learned for the future, that not only we did it, but we communicated about it in a very targeted way, and we were able within the month of April to change the perception and change the perspective. And I think that this was not an anticipated reaction, because nobody saw COVID coming to this extent, but I think we were able to seize the moment and react. And I don't want to dominate the discussion at the beginning, but what we are trying to do with the next generation of Eastern Partnership is to do something similar. By in fact framing the next 10 years of Eastern Partnership around the concept of resilience, which has many important aspects from environmental, societal, economic resilience to really seeing the civil society as one of the key actors and one of the key partners in the Eastern Partnership countries. And I think it's been something that we have been preparing for over the last few years, having framework partners that can help us reach much more grassroots organizations outside of capitals in local languages that put us in a situation where we are now able to really program and engage with civil society in a much broader sense than we were before. And Belarus is an excellent example where you said the civic emancipation is there, and what we are now very busily doing is reprogramming our systems to put a lot more support to them, both to the victims, but also to independent media, to associations fighting the huge hybrid warfare and disinformation campaigns, and also very importantly, something that's new for us until now is supporting local election monitors. We were always relying on big, the ODIHRs and European parliaments of Europe, but I think it's really important now to also develop this and support this layer of local monitoring. So I'll stop there.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for your remarks. And as you spoke so much about resilience, it's quite natural that we now turn to Corina Rebegea and ask about what resilience really, how much difference resilience can bring in the Eastern Europe, but even maybe truly in the whole EU and the NATO framework, as we remember the resilience of Ukrainian society to disinformation of the hybrid war was in a way a sort of a flag, but also one of the early learning platforms for many other countries which are members of the EU or which are US. There is an immense experience of interconnecting the current trends, as we started to talk about trends in the Eastern Partnership that sometimes are a learning exercise. What do you think, Corina?
Thank you, Wojciech, and great to be part of this conversation. I think resilience has become such a buzzword. We will need probably a series of workshops and seminars to go through what it means. From my perspective, I think the focus needs to be more on rule of law and governance, building strong governance, democratic governance. And on that note, just going back to what Ivan was saying earlier, in terms of trends, I think something that has been in the public eye, but also under the radar or ignored, perhaps deliberately, has been the sort of the metamorphosis of conflict in the region we're talking about. So we treated these conflicts as frozen conflicts while they were actually harboring illicit money flows, corruption, source of funding for terrorism, source for oligarchs to do their business and undermine the legitimate governments of these countries. And I think when we're talking about resilience and trends, having allowed all sorts of businesses and shadow banks to operate in these regions and fuel a global machinery of disinformation and also corruption, I think this is something that we haven't paid enough attention towards, and it's something that will, if addressed, will help build sort of the resistance to malign influence, both domestic and foreign, inside the EU or in the transatlantic space and in the Eastern Partnership countries. And then sort of also adding to the trends, I would add this battle for narrative, and Katarina also talked about this, and I think that's important because if we look at and Katarina, you already mentioned this, if we look at the response to the COVID-19 crisis, I think there was even a remark about the billboards that were up in Belgrade thanking China and not the EU, the biggest contributor and also the biggest partner in terms of not just financial assistance, but also commercial flows. And this is not just about disinformation. This is just about talking about the model of governance and integration that these countries are actually aiming to be part of. And then speaking of this, I think the allies, and because the title of our conversation alludes or refers to civil society, I think this is something that we can feel a little more optimistic about or encouraged about, and something that we've seen for many years in the Eastern Partnership region, but not only, also in Central and Eastern Europe, is that civil society organizations have become providers of good governance solutions and expertise. So for a long time, beyond being just watchdogs, these organizations have been policy experts, drafting anti-corruption legislation, drafting whistleblower protection legislation, integrity laws, building institutions, helping governments, sometimes making that move, as we've seen in Ukraine and in Moldova and other countries, moving into government or elected bodies to implement these ideas. And something that this year has brought is also that they've become service providers in ways that perhaps we haven't seen in this region. As organizers, we've seen a lot of petitions and protests and a lot of online activity. Also debunking disinformation and educating the public on the pandemic and on the disinformation campaigns around it. Monitoring the constitutionality of emergency measures and the rule of law during the pandemic, even performing sort of emergency interventions, raising money for that, and at the same time monitoring what the government was doing during the emergency crisis. So I think all of these are signs that there's a sort of a healthy shift in society. And hopefully, if we measure the approval ratings, let's say, of civil society organizations next year, we will see also an increase in hope among population that there are sort of forces, actors in society that they can rely on. I think the most recent surveys we've seen were from last year, and there was still sort of mistrust in society about the role of NGOs. And I think perhaps we will see a reversal of that. So I see here a positive trend, but I think in terms of what comes next and how we envisage the next decade or even the next couple of years, I think we have to be a little bit more strategic in how we engage with these actors. And I think if we've learned anything from EU accession of the Central and Eastern European states and from the 10 years of Eastern Partnership now, particularly in Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, is that no progress is set in stone, and there's always room for reversal and backsliding. And that what we need to produce change is a deeper shift in political power and sort of a structural change inside elites. And again, this is where I think civil society can play a role. I'll end here, but perhaps in this discussion, we can also look at what alternative formats for EU integration we could discuss for the countries of Eastern Partnership. And I've seen a lot of great ideas coming from civil society organizations in the region, kind of advising the European Commission and European Parliament on potential avenues for partial integrations or sectoral integration that could still provide enough incentives for local actors to kind of stay in the Western fold, so to speak, and hopefully produce more structural change that we want to see. And I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Corina. Fantastic. Now, before I turn to Thomas, let me remind everyone who is listening that there is an option through the chat box to start asking questions. We already have one question from Elena Korosteleva, And we will definitely have more. We'll welcome more questions. If you want to type them in the chat box, that is very useful, because then we'll use them definitely. Or just raise your hands through this Zoom function that we know that you want to speak, you want to take the floor with your comments and questions. Now, Thomas, I'm turning to you with also with a bit of a my question in this discussion. We are speaking about the role and importance of civil society. Now, you have extremely long expertise and deep expertise in the Caucasus. You know, we're looking at the conflict, renewed conflict on Nagorno-Karabakh. And my question to you is also on civil society. Are civil societies in both countries the key to solve the issue, or to at least restart a peace project? Thomas.
Thank you very much, Wojciech. Very good to be with you. Yes, I will devote my remarks to the new conflict over Karabakh. I think it would be remiss not to, as there is a fire burning in this region. Two of its countries are at war with one another. So I think this deserves really a very strong attention at the moment. And clearly, because of the history of this conflict of the early 90s, the EU has traditionally not had a role in this conflict. And I think in general, the Eastern Partnership has as it were, struggled to know what to do with the conflicts in this region. Obviously, you know, the EU is very good at domestic reform, at working with bilateral governments. But in a sense, I see that certainly in a place like Abkhazia, I see the EU actually had, in a way, a stronger role before the Eastern Partnership than it does now. That in a sense, the focus on domestic reform has deprioritized the EU's role as a conflict mediator. And when we look at the fires burning now in the Caucasus, unfortunately, we see again, unfortunately, at the moment, civil society marginalized. We see a military fight going on the ground, which has already cost hundreds of lives. We also see an incredibly aggressive and toxic information war going on. If any of you have the misfortune, as I do, to spend time on Twitter in the last week or so, you see that. There are voices for peace, of course, but they are unfortunately rather marginal at the moment. So what went wrong and what can be done? Well, obviously, to give a little historical context, it almost seems as if we're rewinding history here, that the last time Russia and Turkey were both in the Caucasus together at the same time was exactly 100 years ago in 1920, when there was a Turkish-Armenian war and the Bolshevik 11th Army was arriving from Azerbaijan into Armenia exactly 100 years ago. And it seems as though this kind of, unfortunately, this great power, old-fashioned dynamics, it still dominates the Karabakh conflict. That it is, we're seeing Turkey, as it were, playing the game that Russia has been playing recently in places like Ukraine, trying to play that game in the Caucasus now in a very dangerous manner, trying to upset the equilibrium which has been maintained in Karabakh over the last 25 years. The negotiations have also had this rather old-fashioned framework. Unfortunately, they've rather defaulted to a kind of Russian model over the years. France and the United States have both been there, but there's been a kind of lowest common denominator agreement to negotiate in small, smoky rooms with top leaders. Almost no communication with societies. The EU, to its credit, has funded the EPNK, the only strong project that deals with civil society, but that has not at all been integrated within the peace process. The leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan tolerate that process at best and do not talk to people inside it. So we're seeing this very traditional conflict model, a very old-fashioned conflict resolution model. And of course, anyone who deals with conflicts around the world now knows that a conflict is not solved by two leaders signing a piece of paper, that societies need to be engaged in order to move forward. And we're seeing, unfortunately, because of years of neglect of this issue, in contrast to actually the Georgia-Abkhaz conflict or the Transnistrian conflict, where the discourse has improved hugely over the years, the Karabakh conflict is basically as toxic, as polarized as it was in the 1990s. And I think we have to fault the OSCE Minsk process for failing to tackle this issue, that they have done some quite good high-level diplomacy, but their public outreach has been virtually zero. I like to talk about the lack of a third narrative in this conflict, the fact that there are two narratives which fill all the space. But there is a third narrative of peace, of the benefits of peace, the fact that the two countries have lived together in the past and can do so in the future. And no one has been saying that narrative in public. And we're seeing the unfortunate results of that now, in the sense that, again, those two narratives are filling all the space. And we're getting some rather bland statements from the Minsk group, but we're not getting any public pushback. We're not seeing any of these mediators in front of the TV cameras. So unfortunately, I'm painting a rather negative picture of the context of this conflict. And certainly, I think if there is, at some point, there will be a ceasefire on the ground that will be decided almost certainly by Azerbaijan, if it decides it needs a pause, if it's losing soldiers, if it's captured enough ground. At that point, I think there needs to be who fills that vacuum? Is it Russia and Turkey with its traditional great power diplomacy trying to impose a new peace, or do the European actors and possibly even the new United States try to also enter and with a more values and people-based approach? And I think engaging in a new discourse, putting a new narrative of peace out there is incredibly important. And hopefully the EU can help rise to that challenge. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, an invitation to everyone to start asking questions or signaling they want to take the floor in the Q&A session that will begin momentarily in 5-7 minutes. We may be beginning the Q&A already and the discussion with everyone who joined us today. Let's get back to the very title of today's meeting. And there is a question, there is a sort of an implication implicit. We are talking about negative trends when it comes to the Eastern Partnership, Eastern European countries that are unfolding, and we need to discuss the increased resilience for unfolding trends. Now, I want to point out that, just to make it very clear, that there is a number especially in the last 10 years, there's a number of very positive trends all across the board, from economy, from the civil society activities, civic emancipation, if one may want to call it that way, to the trends of upgrading administration, upgrading the technological advance. I don't know if you're aware that most of the countries, all of the countries, until recently, until elections in Belarus, except for Azerbaijan, had already 6% of their trade with the European Union, which is, by the way, the main economic partner for all of these countries, focusing on ITC services. So digital services, digital products have been a new engine of growth for those countries. But of course, there are also negative trends. There are negative trends that we can enumerate, and they're not limited to Eastern Partnership countries, such as depopulation, mostly migration, but also the generally demographic curves are not very optimistic and promising for the countries of this region. Again, with a differentiation here from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is growing. So I'm wondering if those civil society or society focused trends shouldn't be much more of our focus, of our discussion, especially that if we see a robust economic growth, a promise like in Central Europe, that is not matched with or somehow is mixed with the questions of migration, depopulation, brain drain of simply migration of the elites outside, may actually create not a very much a European message, kind of coming back and bouncing back to what we see in the illiberal trends of Central Europe. What are the dangers and how to build resilience against them in Eastern Partnership? Maybe I turn now again to Katerina.
by supporting, you're asking what the civil society can do in addressing these trends.
Or how should the European Union also embrace for potentially, more nationalism, for instance, or more illiberal partners growing on its borders?
Well, I actually think it's by diversifying partnerships and by investing in the grassroots activism. I would take a little bit, go back to what Thomas was saying. Anytime I'm on a panel and I'm from the EU, then everything that one has on mind about the EU then gets sort of personalized to the Commission. I'm just wondering whether we really shouldn't be thinking about the whole panoply of institutions. The European Commission is not equipped to do conflict resolution, whether it's Nagorno-Karabakh or whether it's Abkhazia, etc. All we can do is do flanking supporting measures, as we do in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh. We put together a program for EU for dialogue, etc. There is a whole set of other institutions that deals with conflict resolutions, better or worse, both global and European. And let's not forget that we also have a constituency of 27, which is fairly important, especially when it comes to foreign policy and other countries, and that's the member states. And so we can only do what is the consensus of the member state. This is not an alibistic comment to what you said. I just want to set the record that there is an interplay of many institutions, and I take your point, Thomas, that the Nagorno-Karabakh didn't get the airing or the attention it might have or should have gotten. But I think that one needs to look at different places to address that. And now, Wojciech, to your question, I think that what is important is three things for us to do in the countries. One is to work, as Corina was also talking, on governance, and that means really working on both institutions, both the demand and the supply side of good governance, anti-corruption, helping countries fight the oligarchic systems that many have, both by pushing them as well as providing the support. I mean, I think Ukraine is a fantastic example of really this very, very strong push in this direction. So that's one. The second is to help them grow economically, to help introduce competition and sectoral reforms, support for the SME. So there is actually economic prosperity. And then the third one is to support the non-state actors, support the civil society, and communicate, because I'll repeat, I mentioned it in my first intervention. Let's not forget, one of the strong influences in this region is the very, very, very active, and in this area, I would not call them a middle power. I would call them actually the world power, and that's Russia's disinformation influence and hybrid warfare, which is a big, big, big factor out there, and especially in a situation where a lot of the TV channels, a lot of the traditional media is very much in the hands of a few, having more diversified, thanks to social media, diversified media space, an independent one is critical, and Belarus is a fantastic example of the impact of that.
Thank you. Perhaps last question from me, and then we move to the questions. And already someone wants to take the floor with a comment or question, so we'll have that in a second. Let me turn to Ivan. Ivan, again, I'm playing with around the same concept, and also something you wrote in your book about Central Europe not building up democracy, but imitating the West in building up the institutions that we have seen in. Is there a danger for Eastern Partnership countries and Eastern Europe broadly that they follow the same path, or they can innovate themselves somehow and escape the troubled fate of countries that we consider Central Europe?
Well, listen, I do believe we're in a totally different moment. In 1989, for good or for bad, we have the idea that we know where the history is moving. There was one model and you can imitate it, you can fake it, you are going to adjust to it. And of course, there is nothing wrong about imitating. So we all imitate all the time. The problem is that, of course, you're going to get a resentment. I do believe these countries are in a slightly more difficult position. And I agree very much with you that the demographic trends are very similar to the one that we have also in Central Europe. But also we don't know what is going to be the impact of COVID-19 on the movement of people. One of the things that you can see is that many of the labor migrants can come back. On the other side, because of the economic crisis, you can see even more pressure of the people to leave. And this is going to be different from region to region. And of course, the war is one of the things that is basically convincing people to exit, basically don't want to live in this situation. On the other side, you have the mobilization power of the nationalistic narratives. And I'm saying this because in a strange way, this is, and Thomas was right in a certain way, we lost the narrative. We have the policies, we basically know how to help certain administration to be more effective or not. But if you're looking at some of the major actors, and this is true for Russia these days, it's very much true for Turkey, in the moment of a very high uncertainty, both economic, political, geopolitical, you try to get certain type of a symbolic power. Honestly speaking, everybody of them is looking for their Crimean moment, where you can basically unify the nation based on the foreign policy and other things. And from this point of view, for the civil society, is going to be very difficult. And by the way, at least for what we are calling civil society, because many of these nationalistic groups are easily fitting the general idea of civil society. So I do believe one of the things, and I could be wrong, and it's very difficult if you should basically come with policies from outside. But for me, it's very important to understand that situation has changed. And not because the values of the people are changed. And Belarus is a great example that there is a universal drive for freedom. People want to change. So this is not going to change. But also how the external actors are going to be perceived. We are also going to be in a period in which, obviously, the United States is not going to be active in this region as it was. European Union, which was very much based on one level on the soft power, on the other on the economic instruments, is going to face players that use other type of powers. And for me, the most interesting things that comes also from the Azeri-Armenian conflict is there was a certain type of a tacit understanding between everybody about the frozen conflicts that the military solutions does not work. If this is going to change in Nagorno-Karabakh, believe me, everybody is going to take the note. And from this point of view, this is going to be a totally different game. I don't believe that we can basically blame the climate change for the unfreezing of these conflicts.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan. Now there's a question I'm going to read, and I think I can address it to Corina first. Elena Kostereva writes with, I think, a bit of a tone of skepticism about the foreign democratic assistance, if you may call it, in a nutshell. Her comment is much longer, and you can read it on the chat. She expresses a much stronger belief in grassroots build-up of the civil society and the resilience, focusing on the good life. Now, where does it leave all the concept of international assistance? Even civil society to civil society connectivity. Part of the goal or ambition in Eastern Partnership would be, of course, to have Belarusians connect with Ukrainians and so on. But it's maybe not happening. How do you see that? What's your take on this international and local grassroots aspect?
Thank you. That's a great dilemma, and I don't disagree that it's up to the local actors to produce the change that they want to see in their societies at local or national level. I do think, though, that they don't operate in a vacuum. And a lot of the things that they can implement locally will depend on international decisions and support. And just to give you an example, I mean, disinformation is a clear example of that. It permeates any type of imaginable borders, both physical and virtual. Same with corruption. And I think as long as Belarusian, Moldovan, Ukrainian, whichever oligarch you're trying to fight domestically is able to launder their money in Delaware or in London or in Cyprus, and the transatlantic community doesn't do anything about, or the G7 or the G20 don't do anything about it, I think the work of the local actors will be very negatively impacted. So while, you know, if we look back at the experience of Central and Eastern European countries that are now members of the EU, and there's a big body of literature that shows that the power of, not just the power of seduction, but the power of norm creation and enforcement of the EU in these countries in certain ways has decreased after accession. And I think we also see that in the Eastern Partnership countries to a certain extent. I still think there is power in having that normative supranational umbrella that local actors can refer to, can lean back on when they're being targeted by domestic political forces, and can also learn from. And I think, and that goes back to creating those networks of local actors of change, if you will, where Belarusians can learn from Ukrainians that have done actually a great amount of work in exposing corruption. And there's a project that UNTAC just launched 2 weeks ago dealing just with that. So I think there is still scope for that. We might have to reimagine what that looks like. And the solutions that we've used so far, you know, give a grant, make it hard for people to get that grant and to report on it, and then and see what happens may not be the best solution. And I think we'll have to reimagine that relationship.
Thank you, Corina, so much. Now we'll give the floor to the first question, video question or comment by Hovsep Khurshudyan. I am very sorry if I mispronounced your name. Hovsep?
Yes. Can you
Please,
hear me?
The floor is yours.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and my greetings to my colleagues whom I have doesn't seen many years, including Ms. Maternova. We have met last time in Bratislava during the conference, Youth Conference on Human Rights. So I would like to ask a small question to Thomas, but before I would speak shortly about another aspect of this war in Karabakh, because I saw that this is not only just a war for Nagorno-Karabakh, but it is war against Armenian democracy. And you can see that this war started in 30 years, just after Armenian Revolution, after a democracy started succeeding in Armenia. Because if you know, last year, Armenian economic growth was the highest in Europe and the more in the all post-Soviet countries. And this example probably was very, very dangerous for some autocracies, especially in the club of autocracies in which Armenia now is part of this club, Eurasian Union, you know about this. So the problem I see, I think, to punish Mr. Pashinyan for starting war against corruption in our country, to starting criminal persecutions against previous presidents, one of which was, let's say, friend of Mr. Putin, and he announced about that. And when we have listened Russian experts from Moscow, all of them saying that they are very angry for Nikol Pashinyan's policy, especially in European direction, because by these democratic reforms, we started to also to make more powerful our independence from, as well from Russia. So that is why today's Putin's interview, if you have heard, he said that the Russia have nothing to do with this conflict because it's not war. It is not war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So
yes, your question. Maybe yes, that would be the good time.
My question to Thomas: do you see any possibility from European side? Because today was very interesting talk in European Parliament on this issue, to make any pressure to Azerbaijani and Turkish side who started this aggression against Nagorno-Karabakh people with cause of deporting all Armenian population as it was before planned. So by this pressure, but some sanctions to stop this aggression. Do you see this possibility?
Okay, thank you for the question. Thank you very much. Thomas, this is a question directed to you.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not expecting any reaction of that sort on the European side. We know that there is different member states have different relationships, bilateral relationships with the two countries involved. You know, Greece and Cyprus being quite close to Armenia, Hungary, for example, expressing solidarity with Azerbaijan. So I'm afraid this is one of those cases where it won't be so simple. I think you know, there is a consensus at least that the conflict, there needs to be a ceasefire and much more serious negotiations than we've seen for many years. I think hopefully there is a consensus there, but I'm afraid at the moment everyone is watching Baku, Ankara, Moscow in particular, also Yerevan, of course. But just briefly to comment to Katerina, I mean, the EU is one of the last players I would criticize on this conflict, and it's probably not very useful to talk about the past. The EU has obviously had no big foreign policy role in the early 90s when this conflict began, but this is certainly a moment for the EU to try and step up and respond, and as I say, try and express a different narrative, a different view, a people and values-based view, which is extremely sorely missing. And you know, just to remind you, you know, this is not a theoretical question. Two Eastern Partnership countries are currently at war. So you know, I don't think we should be. Many of the other debates on governance, etc. in the Eastern Partnership, I think, can wait until we tackle this fire burning between two countries there.
Katerina, do you want to respond on that?
No, I very much agree with you, but you know, I try to anytime I speak publicly use this little pedagogy that I don't represent the EU. What you're saying, yes, I agree with you, and it's in the hands of the member states. We have a foreign policy based on veto power, for good or for worse. You know, Cyprus would now say they got what they wanted out of the EU. They allowed the Belarusian sanctions go, so that policy protects the little ones vis-a-vis the big ones. So you can have a whole, you know, books and debates on it. But I agree with you, but there is a difference what the EU institutions can do and the member states can do. I represent an EU institution, so while I may have a private agreement with you, it's not going to happen until the EU, meaning the composite members of the EU agree on something that a stance like that would be possible. And as you just said, there are member states that are on different side of this. The same thing was with Libya, right? Somebody was, we had member states straddling the different parts. And as long as that happens, there is not going to be an EU, clear EU stance. Mm-hmm. As wide as it may.
Okay, we are exactly 1 hour into the discussion. We have 15 minutes left. We'll be also soon wrapping up, but let me point to one of the chat messages. Elena, to whose question Corina was responding, is elaborating more. I don't need to read the whole question. You can find it on the chat, but she emphasizes the already ongoing nature of this springing up initiatives and the potential, even economic potential on the ground that has been demonstrated in the case of Belarus. It's an interesting take, elaborating on the points of Corina. Corina, you may feel free to address that. But before that, there is a person waiting in the line to ask a question in person, Zahari Paikin. Zahari?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for all your very thought-provoking comments. I'd like to address a question to Thomas and to Ivan regarding the sources of Russian foreign policy and the objectives of Russian foreign policy and the consequences that your answer would have for questions surrounding civil society, resilience, but also EU foreign policy more broadly in Eastern Europe, and particularly in the Eastern Partnership countries that are situated in Eastern Europe. And it has to do with, on the one hand, many people would state that Russia's interest in either retaining Belarus within its so-called sphere of privileged interests, or a desire to, exercise a degree of control over the political situation in Belarus is largely due to geopolitical and security-related factors, right? So people would say that in order for Russia to retain a position as a European, great power or security actor, and therefore as a global great power as well, there needs to be at least one country in Europe sort of aligned with the Russian geopolitical orbit. The other argument is sort of the more values or political argument, which says that, Russia is very keen to prevent any sort of significant political change in Belarus, not because it's necessarily afraid that the country will drift towards the West, but rather because they don't want to set a precedent for something that could happen within Russia itself within a few years. So I hear both of those arguments all the time, and I'm wondering for the two of you, which of those arguments do you find most convincing? And depending on which one you find more convincing, how should the EU therefore readjust its foreign policy in the region with regards to questions surrounding resilience and civil society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's begin with Thomas. Thomas, can you address that? That was a direct question.
Yeah, I was hoping that Ivan would take that one first. I'm not sure I'm going to directly answer that. I'm seeing both in Belarus and in Karabakh, and possibly now in Kyrgyzstan as well, the limitations of Russia's near abroad policy. It's based on a sort of, almost a kind of phantom of great influence. And yet these countries, as we've seen, are in multiple neighborhoods, and they're quite capable of dealing with other neighbors, and whether the famous Eurasian shuffle that Mr. Lukashenko practiced over many years, or again, Azerbaijan now using Ankara as its big ally in the Caucasus. And I see the Russians struggling to come up with a policy. I see, knowing, I think Crimea was a big exception in many ways for Mr. Putin. I think in general, he's quite risk averse. He doesn't want to plan a big adventure or a big intervention unless he knows that the public will enjoy it enormously and that it will end up successful. And I think a more direct intervention in Belarus, or indeed a Russian military intervention in the Karabakh situation, would deliver neither of those things. So I think we're seeing, in my view, the limitations of Russian policy. Obviously, Belarus is much closer to Russia, and they have more levers there. But again, if you're asking for my analysis there, I do think that the fear of a kind of, that in a few years' time the Belarus scenario would repeat itself in Russia would be the main fear in Moscow. That would be my feeling. What can the EU do in Belarus? Well, in Belarus, it's on its border. But I've written recently about this. The EU has been very disengaged from Belarus over the last 20 years. I think it has a lot to offer in the medium to long term. And in the short term, paradoxically, the best it can do is by being as anti-geopolitical as it can in Belarus. And I think it is sending that message that this is not about West versus East. This is purely about supporting Belarusian society, and hoping that the Lukashenko regime will crumble of its own accord, and the EU will have more openings then.
Yeah, thank you. And let me remind that the last council concluded last week, adopted the proposal to put forward an economic recovery package to the reformed Belarus, or future democratic Belarus, let's say. Let's see how Commission will address that. Perhaps Katerina will will tell us a bit about that. But before that, Ivan, please, the last question was addressed equally to you.
Listen, I don't believe that these two hypotheses go against each other. I do believe both of them are present in the Russian thinking. Russia is in a difficult position in all the conflicts that we're talking about. In a way, they're in a lose-lose situation. The Belarusian protest and opposition was extremely smart, trying to signal to Russia that regime change does not need to meet the geopolitical change. And don't forget that Belarus is dependent on Russia economically in the way the Ukraine was not. But at the same time, the Russian leadership is very much traumatized by what happened in Ukraine. So on one level, everybody tries, by the way, this trolls on the Western side, to do things that they believe that they should have done in Ukraine. From this point of view, it's interesting to see what Russia risks in Belarus is the following. It's not a secret that there is not particularly warm personal relations between Mr. Lukashenko and President Putin. And honestly speaking, basically, Mr. Lukashenko was playing the Tito game that Moscow didn't like much. But one of the fears is that anytime you have a democratic opening in a post-Soviet space, it takes a geopolitical turn. Basically, Russia is losing influence. So this is why fear, it's not simply that what is happening in Belarus can be repeated in Moscow, but basically that certain type of a change that did not start as an anti-Russian change can do it. On the other side, I very much agree with Thomas. Russia is very much afraid to be over-involved in all of these conflicts. Russian military intervention in Belarus is going to create anti-Russian sentiment in a country that basically is one of the few in the region where there is no anti-Russian nationalism. In the case of Armenian and Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is, if Russia does nothing, some of its security guarantees are going to be put into question, and the credibility of Russia in the region is going to be put into question. But on the other side, I don't believe that Russia wants to go into a conflict neither with Azerbaijan nor Turkey. And particularly what is interesting, and this came from the question of our Armenian colleague, Russia is giving two types of security guarantees. One is to the state, but the other is to the political leaders. So having a friendly political leader in prison is also not something that Russia very much kind of is happy with. So what I do believe, and this is the interesting story, this is why I do believe we're in a very kind of a particular moment because strangely enough, some of the small states, not simply the middle states, are going to have a much more opportunity to make a big change exactly because they're trying to take the initiative and they're much more high risk. There was such an injection of uncertainty coming with the COVID-19 that honestly speaking, I do believe that the thinking in Moscow is very different than one in 2014.
Thank you, Ivan. We'll ask Katerina perhaps to conclude with the whole discussion, or if you want, you can address the questions now. I see that you are ready to do that.
Just to comment quickly. One, circling back to Nagorno-Karabakh and my point that it has to be the member states who take the initiative. I'm just informed that French Foreign Minister Yves Le Drian announced yesterday that he's going to have talks in Geneva tomorrow and next week, Monday, and try to work with Russia to convince the warring parties to put down the weapons. So let's see, at least there is some activity on the...
Can I make a joke, keeping in mind the very warm relationship between President Erdogan and President Macron? This is kind of a promising beginning.
And, it's going to be interesting. And then on Belarus, Thomas, speaking on your point that we should behave in a we should treat it non-geopolitically. That's as if you were in fact listening to our internal deliberations, because that's what we are trying to do. We actually see the Belarusian activism and civic awakening, as Wojciech called it, as their legitimate expectations for having a regular, normal society. So what we try to do, and how we are looking at recalibrating our support to Belarus, is to try to find ways how to work directly with citizens. And I don't mean only civil society, obviously, but scholarship for students to study in Europe, SME support, to sort of win hearts and minds of people, and provide more assistance to the victims of violence, and then work, not work via the central authorities, because as you know, in the last conclusions, the EU leaders called for new elections in Belarus, and we think that that is what should happen.
Yes, thank you very much, Katerina. Let me also remind everyone, and especially turning now to Corina with the questions again on grassroots, how much the digital age is present in the Eastern Partnership in Eastern Europe, but all over. I mean, that's a global phenomena. Now that we see in Belarus, this was also part of an enormously contributing factor, where a lot of the so-called Belarusian, Silicon Valley, they have a Belarusian sort of a tech park. They used to have one, because many of these companies withdraw, attracted a lot of talents that were there already in Belarus. They wanted to stay in Belarus, but be more and more connected to the world. Maybe these are the ways. Corina, what do you think? To increase such interconnectivity in the digital economies, perhaps? Does it go along with democracy resilience?
Thanks, Wojciech. I think that's already happening without any stimulus, right? And I mean, this digital component is part of the EAP agenda for these countries, obviously, and there is the economic side of it. But I think on the information exchange and connectivity and actually spread of disinformation, that's, as we've seen, very little we can do to control how things go, unfortunately, to a certain extent. And this is one of the bigger debates on both sides of the Atlantic now, how these digital tools can be made to increase democratic participation rather than further lead to polarization and polluting of the democratic debate in society. And I don't think we found, I mean, it was just yesterday that we had a hearing on the Capitol Hill. And of course, the EU is hard at work trying to figure out how to go about this. But I think, so that's a debate that I think we will be having for quite a while. But Thomas left, and I want to just very briefly to perhaps start a polemic.
Not the right moment, really.
Not the right moment, I agree. But and Katarina also mentioned the geopolitical lens, and I think we've had some valuable lessons from Moldova and Ukraine, and how civil society has reacted, and domestic political actors, to the exclusive geopolitical framing of certain events, domestic political events, and elections. And I think just going back and looking at what we got wrong about that is important. And related to that, I think just the focus on governance is important, because that was the demand that came from civil society actors, grassroots in all of these countries. And I think when we look at dealing with hot conflicts and governance, I don't think there is a way necessarily to separate them. I think they feed into each other, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And the EU and the US, NATO, Western European countries should be able to address both challenges at once, and not allow sometimes conflict to obscure the responses that we need to have on governance issues.
Thank you, Corina. I think we can conclude here. And I thank all of you. I thank Ivan Krastev, Katerina Maternova, Corina Rebegea, and Thomas De Waal, who just left, but as announced, he had to go, for sharing your comments. Thank you also for excellent questions and comments during the Q&A. Today, a bit of self-advertising. Do have a look at the Eastern Partnership 2030 report with scenarios, because it was one of these grassroots initiatives which was produced by people who are in Eastern Partnership countries, bringing in their fears, threat perceptions, but also hopes of what scenarios may develop in the future. We're continuing to run discussions also around that. It was a fantastic time to spend together with you online, even though, and I hope we see each other soon in person when the pandemic allows.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Very much.